Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about workflow. We're going to be starting from the very beginning and talking about basic principles of workflow, what workflow means and what each of the different parts of workflow means. And then we're going to show some examples of useful workflows that you can set up in your system. A lot of those examples will come from actual customer requests that I've had as I've done trainings with customers and they've asked for certain ways to set up their workflow. So they're very real life and applicable examples that you should be able to work with. Let's start just by defining what workflow is. To do that, I want to open just one of my test quotes. Loosely defined, I would say that workflow is just the flow of your work as you're working through these different elements. So for example, when you start a new quote by default, it starts in the inquiry state, which is tied to the inquiry status. And then we'll use workflow to move around the different states and statuses. So for example, if I want to confirm the quote, I could click the workflow action, confirm quote. If I want to cancel the quote, I would hit the workflow action, cancel quote. And that's the first term that I want to define is just workflow action. Those are going to be the different actions that are listed on each element as the options for you to be able to execute. Now, when you click a workflow action, a few things happen that we call workflow jobs. So if I click confirm quote, the workflow job that is set up for that workflow action is to send this confirmation email. That's just one workflow job that happens when I click that workflow action. And this is just a confirmation email that will just notify anybody that I choose that this quote has been confirmed. So I click OK, the quote gets confirmed, and you'll notice that now I'm in a new state. I'm in the confirmed state, so I have different workflow actions to choose from. I could reset it to inquiry, I could still cancel it, reset to tentative, or I can create a pull sheet or flag it as ready to invoice. So that's what you'll notice as we go through this discussion on workflow, is that as you go through these different workflow states, you'll have different workflow actions to choose from in each state. And then each workflow action can have those different workflow jobs tied to them. So for example, if I click Create Update Pull Sheet, this one actually has two workflow jobs assigned. Number one, it's going to send out this confirmation email. And then number two, it's going to create a pull sheet. That's the second workflow job, is an actual element generator. So this time it created a pull sheet. So now that we've looked at a few examples of what workflow is, let's start digging into the actual parts of the workflow, defining each of them and showing you how you can set up new ones. The first place I actually want to look is in the System Settings menu, and I want to look at the status options. It's important to understand status options because each workflow state is going to be tied to a certain status. So for example, if we go to the Projects menu, click Workflow, and let's just go to the quote workflow. That's probably what we'll be working with the most today. The initial state that we start in is inquiry. And you'll notice that our inquiry state here is tied to the inquiry status. That means that when we are in the inquiry state, then that state is going to take on the attributes of the inquiry status. So let's go back to status options. And if we look at inquiry, you'll notice inquiry does not create conflicts, meaning if a quote is in the inquiry status, it does not book the gear on that quote. It's not a closed or locked status. It doesn't lock availability. And then you can see some of the other options too, like the status color, for example, when you're on the calendar. And then a few other things like probability, how the text appears, etc. We're not going to look too much at what each of these options does, but the most important ones you want to think about are the creates conflicts, yes or no. Because remember, when we moved from inquiry to confirm, When we go to the confirmed state, notice that the status that it's tied to is confirmed. And if you look at status options for confirmed, you'll see a few differences. The main one being creates conflicts equals yes. So the second I confirmed that last quote, then all of a sudden all the gear on that quote is being booked between the dates of the quote because it's in a confirmed status that creates conflicts. I'm always very cautious when I come into the status options page, because if I just make a change and then happen to forget that I make that change, it could really mess up the way that conflicts are created in your system. And so your availability might get a little bit messed up if you change creates conflicts, update that, and not really know what you're doing. So that's why we do these webinars, just so you can understand what these options mean so that you know not to make changes to them unless you really know what you're doing. So those are statuses, and just remember that each workflow state is tied to a status. For the most part, you'll find that those states and statuses are just going to have the same name. We'll look at one example where they might not have the same name, but for the most part, I would say they do just share a similar name. Let's start by looking at and defining workflow states. So we've already talked about it a little bit. A workflow state is going to be tied to a certain status. And then we're going to use workflow actions to move around to each state. So again, because we start in the inquiry state, we have certain actions over here that will lead us to the next state. So starting from inquiry, if we click confirm quote, let's actually open this workflow action settings to see what happens. So I'm going to click confirm quote here. The name is just what it's called, how it's going to appear on a quote in the workflow section. Confirm screen enable will just say, after you've completed the action, do you want Flex to pop up a window that tells you what just happened? I usually say no. The source state is the state that this workflow action is going to be available from. And the target state is the state that you want to be able to get into through that workflow action. So we're starting an inquiry. We want to get to confirmed. The type is a little bit more of an advanced option. I do have a webinar on this if you want to watch that. It's on our YouTube page, but we're not going to look at that here. This would basically just be the option to change what name appears on the PDF printout. Do you want it to say estimate, order, proposal, etc.? So go find that webinar if you're interested in that, but we're not going to cover it in this webinar. You can also tie parent and child actions to a workflow action. The best examples of these would be like an event folder. If I were to cancel an event folder, then I might want a child action of the quote workflow to cancel all the child quotes underneath that event folder. Similarly, if I confirm a quote that has a parent of an event folder, then I might want to chain the parent action of the event workflow to confirm the event folder as well. So that could be useful if you want upstream or downstream elements to go through a workflow action as well when you execute this workflow action. The executor groups are just going to be security groups that are able to execute this action. You probably want most people to be able to confirm a quote, but let's say, for example, when we get to the flag is ready to invoice action, you might only want certain groups to be able to do that, like accounting or administrators. So that's what the executor groups are. It just limits this action to only be viewable and executable by whatever groups are listed. If no groups are listed, that just means that anybody who belongs to any security group will be able to execute that action. And then, of course, the last two that we'll talk about quite a bit more are the workflow jobs. You have both inflow jobs and outflow jobs. I get this question a bit, what's the difference between inflow or outflow? I really don't see much of a difference at all. I always just use outflow jobs. Basically, these are just going to be the jobs or the things that happen when I execute a workflow action. So for example, if we go back to our confirm quote, remember when we clicked confirm quote from a quote, the outflow job was quote confirmed workflow job. All of your workflow jobs are listed on your projects menu. So if we look at the quote confirmed workflow job, it's really just this email notification that sends out to anybody that I want, just informing them that the quote has been confirmed. So that's a question I get a lot too. When that confirm quote email template pops up, how do I modify that? Easy, just go to the projects menu, click workflow jobs, then find whichever one you want to modify. So in this case, we were looking at the quote confirmed. And then I can come in here and change the subject line, the message text, add anything I want to it. I could even add the to addresses. So maybe I always want it to send to accounting at whatever your company is or something like that. Just separate your email addresses by a comma. And so those are workflow jobs, and most workflow jobs are just going to be a simple email notification. We also have some of these other workflow jobs like a pull sheet generator, that's going to be an equipment list generator, or like an invoice generator. But as you can see, most of your workflow jobs are just going to be these simple email notifications that sends out an email anytime you're executing a workflow action. We'll come back to these in a minute when we start looking at a certain type of workflow that we can set up. But let's just go back to our quote workflow really quick and just finish up kind of talking about how this flow works, and then we'll look at setting up a couple of custom workflows that you might find useful in your system. So again, if we start in the inquiry state by clicking confirm quote, that brings us to the target state of confirmed. So let's open up the confirmed state. And notice too, these are all of the actions that you have available to you. You can drag and drop these. If you open up a state, I could drag and drop these so that they appear in a certain order on a quote. So when I'm in the confirmed state, maybe I want create, update, pull sheet to show up first, then flag is ready to invoice, then maybe reset to tentative, reset to inquiry, then finally cancel quote, so that my most important ones are up top. So notice now, if I go back and open up this quote, and I believe I'm still in the confirmed state, so now you can see how the order of those workflow options has changed based on how I drag them over here. And this is also just a really nice way to see how do you get to the confirmed state. You have the inflow actions, and then the outflow actions are the way that you can get out of the state. So for example, let's go back to our quote workflow and look at maybe ready to invoice state. The way that you can get into this is by either clicking flag is ready to invoice, and this is probably coming from the confirmed state. And the other way you can get into it is with this one here that's called create, update, pull sheet, but this one comes from the ready to invoice state. And that's the last thing that I wanted to mention before we started setting up a few custom workflows, is that these workflow actions don't necessarily have to change which state you're in. Sometimes workflow actions are only there to execute an outflow job or a workflow job. So in this example, when you're sitting in the ready to invoice state, you might want to generate the pull sheet or update the pull sheet again without it changing the status. You'll notice there's a very similar one in the confirmed state. The generate, update, pull sheet. When I click this action, I don't want it to change the status. I want it to stay in the confirmed state. All I want it to do is send out the pull sheet generator. And I did some modification here earlier, but I want it to send out the pull sheet generator, and then probably some sort of, I don't have one right now, but I could set up a workflow job that's called pull sheet has been updated or something like that, that would send out an email notification to anybody so that they know that I've just updated the pull sheet. So those are the basic principles behind workflows. Let's take a few minutes and set up a few custom workflows, and we'll cover all those principles again. So if some of that went over your head, don't worry, we'll cover them again as we go and start setting up some of these different workflows. Let's start with one that I see as a pretty common request, and this would be a notification that changes have been made. So for example, let's say that somebody starts a quote, confirms it, and when they're in the confirmed state, somebody makes changes and they want to send out an email notification informing people that they've made changes. So let's start by going to our projects menu and click Workflow Jobs. And what we want to do is actually set up a new simple email notification workflow job that's basically called something like Notify of Changes or something like that. So let's go and create a new simple email notification job. And instead of having to fill out all of those different substitution tokens, remember when we opened up that quote confirmed, it's not just text. There's a lot of these different substitution tokens that we use, and Flex will pull that data so that it will show quote names, event names, status names, etc. for that particular quote. So what I like to do is just copy a lot of that information from one workflow job, so the quote confirmed in this case, and then just paste it into my new one. And I could just change, like for example, I'm not confirming a quote with this workflow job. I'm changing. So quote number has been changed by, and then it will show whoever executed this workflow job. Same with the subject line. I could just copy, paste, and instead of sending out an email notification that it's been confirmed, we're just sending out an email notification that this job has been changed. I'll want to give it a name, maybe call it quote changes. The code can just be anything you want. I'll just call it QC or something like that, maybe QCH. The from address, we use the code user. That will just be whoever's logged in and executing that workflow job. So in my case, that user would fill in as my email address. And then the to address, if I put auto, that's going to take the account manager for that job. But I could also do comma and say, maybe I want it to send out to all of my salespeople. Now the scenario here being, if you're the account manager for the job, it's not going to send to you. Flex will automatically see, oh, you're the user and you're also the account manager, so the to address would just be blank. But if you log in and you're changing somebody else's quote, then it will send automatically to the account manager in that to address. So let's click Create so that we have a new workflow job. Let's go back to our workflow jobs list and reload so that we could see quote changes as a new simple email notification. So that's all well and good. We have the email notification now, but now we need a way to be able to send that email notification. So we're going to do that through a workflow action. And we could set up a workflow action on any state that we want. In fact, we might even want to set up a workflow action on multiple states that does the same exact thing. Let's start with just setting up a workflow action for the confirmed state. So I'm going to go up here and say new workflow action. I'm going to call it Notify of Changes. This is exactly what you'll see on the workflow options when you're inside a quote. I don't need the confirm screen. This is one of those scenarios where I'm not necessarily changing the state. The source state is confirmed and so is the target state. I don't really need to chain this to any upstream or downstream elements, and I don't really need to restrict this to any security groups either. So I'll leave all those blank, but for the outflow job, I'm going to choose that new quote changes workflow job that I just created. And then click Create. So let's go back and open that quote again. Remember, this quote is currently in the confirmed state, and so now I have a new workflow action called Notify of Changes that when I click, it's going to send out the quote changed email template that I set up. And remember, I'm the account manager, but I'm also logged in, so it doesn't show my address in the distribution list. If somebody else logged in and did that, then it would send to me because they would be executing something on my quote that I'm the account manager for. So that's just a really easy example of one. Let's look at a couple other simple examples, and then we'll go to one that's a little bit more intermediate. Or one thing before we move on from that, remember, like I said, you might want to set up the same workflow action in different states. Because if I'm in the tentative state, I'm not going to see the notify of changes option, because I only set that notify of changes option up in the confirm state. So basically, I would just go click new workflow action. Everything will be exactly the same, except the source and target state this time is going to be tentative. I can call it the same thing. I could give it the same outflow job, but this time it's going to be available to me from the tentative state. So you might have to set up some of those workflow actions 2, 3, or 4 times depending on which states you want them available from. The other easy example that I wanted to show really quick is, I get this request a lot. What if I want to confirm a quote and create a pull sheet at the same time? Because normally you would have to click confirm quote, and then that would go through the whole workflow process, and then I would have to click create update pull sheet. Some people have a workflow where they want to confirm and create the pull sheet at the same time. I've already done that in this system, but let me show you how I did it. So again, I just went up and clicked create new workflow action. But since I've already created it, let's just open it and I'll show you the options that I filled in. I called it confirm and create pull sheet. Confirm screen enabled is no. My source state is inquiry because that's the state that I want this workflow action to show in. And my target state is going to be confirmed because I'm going to be confirming the quote as part of this action. Again, I don't have any chained parent or child actions. I don't necessarily want to restrict this, but maybe you do. So maybe you just want to say, I only want sales reps or administrators to be able to do this, but in my scenario, I don't restrict that to any particular group. Anybody can execute this action. And then the outflow jobs, this is where I have 2. Number 1, it's going to use the pull sheet generator. So if you want to select that for the outflow jobs, just find it from the list, click it, and then click add. And then I also chose the quote confirmed simple email template and added that. And then I clicked update. And so now let's find a job that's still in the inquiry state. From the inquiry state, I can both confirm the job and generate a pull sheet just with one simple click. So there's my pull sheet, and my job is now in the confirm state. So you can probably imagine a few other examples using the model that I just showed you with those 2 simple ones. A few other examples that might benefit you in your system. The last simple one that I want to show is actually just a way to bypass the general or the default workflow. So for example, right now, when you're in a confirmed state, to create an invoice, first you have to click flag as ready to invoice, and that goes from confirm to ready to invoice and sends out the quote ready to invoice email template. And then from ready to invoice is the only place that you can actually generate an invoice. Some people like this. It depends on how your company's set up and who does what in the company, because a lot of times you might have a dedicated team of sales reps and you don't necessarily want them dealing with invoices. So they would click flag as ready to invoice, that would send to accounting, and then accounting would open that quote in the ready to invoice state and click generate invoice. But I know there's a lot of companies that are kind of all hands on deck. Everybody wears many different hats, And so the same person that created the quote and is going through the workflow might want to generate the invoice as well. And so maybe you want to skip this step because all you're doing is just clicking flag is ready to invoice, then immediately generating the invoice. Granted, that's only a 10 or 15 seconds of extra time, but that could add up over time. And if it's a step that you don't have to take every single time, then we could certainly create a new workflow action to bypass that. So let me show you what we're going to do here, and we're actually going to use executor groups as an example in this case. Let's go to create a new workflow action. This one is going to be called generate invoice. Don't necessarily need a confirm screen. You might have that set up, but like I said, I always just like to keep that as no. I want this action to be available to me in the source state of confirmed, and I want it to go to the invoice created status because I'm going to be generating an invoice. This one I might restrict to certain people like administrators and accounting. And then the outflow jobs are going to be number 1, the invoice generator. So I'll choose that and then click add. And it looks like I don't necessarily have a email template that says that an invoice has been created. So I could go create one, a new workflow job, and assign that as an outflow job. But in this case, probably the person who's generating the invoice might be the person who needs to know. So maybe you don't even need an email template. But again, if you do, just go to projects, workflow jobs, and create a new simple email notification that you might call invoice created for quote or something like that. So I'll click create, and notice what will happen now if I go back into my quote that's in the confirm state. Since I'm an administrator in my system, I see the option to generate an invoice. So let's say maybe somebody who's assigned to the sales rep group opens up this quote. They're not going to see this option. They're still going to have to go through the flag is ready to invoice process. But since I'm an administrator or accounting, I could just immediately generate an invoice without having to go through that step. So that's one really good example of why you might use executor groups. You might want some people to be able to see that option and others maybe not. Let's take our last maybe 5 to 7 minutes and look at how we could create a little bit more of an advanced workflow. We won't go through the whole process, but I'll kind of get you started on this so that you can see some of the principles and maybe get some ideas of how you would set it up in your system. A lot of times when you start your quote in inquiry, instead of going straight to tentative or confirmed, excuse me, I see a lot of companies who are looking to go into some sort of awaiting approval status or state or something like that. So let's look at a couple different options and how we can do that. Number 1, you might actually go and create some new statuses. So if you go to System Settings and Status Options, you might create a new status that's called awaiting approval or something like that. Maybe it's set up much like the inquiry status where it creates conflicts no. In fact, let's just set one up now. So I'm going to call it awaiting approval. Creates conflicts no. Historical record yes. I think the probability on inquiry was 33. And I could either give it a similar color to inquiry or maybe something that's slightly different just so we know that it's in a different status. That would be the main benefit of actually setting up a whole new status. And I don't know if I actually created that. I think I might have hit cancel instead. But that would be the benefit of actually creating an entirely new status, is that now you have status colors that you can deal with. And you can see those on a calendar. So if you were to use that method, you would both create a new status and a new state that's called awaiting approval, because remember, it's workflow actions that will get you between states. So we'd have to create a new state, and then you could choose maybe that new status that you just created. But I've also seen people just say, I'm only dealing with moving from state to state, but states can have the same status applied to them. So in this scenario, I have a new awaiting approval state, but it's still tied to the same status as of inquiry. Now, your question might be, well, what if I want to be able to see what state it's in? Because if I move this quote sound system into awaiting approval state, the status is still going to show as inquiry. What I could do is go and edit my calendar columns and add a new one that shows the state. And it's not on the suggestions window here. I was working with a customer recently, and I believe it's element.current workflow with a capital W, state with a capital S. And I think you could even throw .name at the end of that too. Oops, added it twice. And so this will actually show both the status and the state that the quote is in. And let's actually move that so that it's right next to status to make it a little bit easier on us. Now, like I said earlier, most of the time, status and state is just going to be the same exact name. But in this example that we're setting up now in our quote workflow, we actually have a new state that's just using the old status. So that was step one. I created a new state. It's still just using the inquiry status, but that's okay. Now I need a way to get into that state. And you guessed it, we're going to use a workflow action to get in and out of that state. And in this case, we probably also want some sort of workflow job or email template to send out whenever I'm moving from inquiry to awaiting approval state. And it looks like I don't have one really that is called quote awaiting approval, so let's create a new one. I'm going to create a new simple email notification job. And just like I did last time, I'm just going to copy and paste from a previously created one, but then change the name. So instead of confirmed, I'm going to say has been submitted for approval. Same with the subject line. Copy, paste, and instead of confirmed, has been submitted for approval. The from address, again, is going to be you as the user. The to address, in this case, you probably want to send to specific people, like the boss at company name or, head of sales or something like that. So the to address might be very specific in that case. Let's give it a name, quote, submit for approval. And again, the code can just be whatever you want. And then click create. So let's go back to our quote workflow, and we want to create a new workflow action. Submit for approval. Confirm screen, no. We want this to move us from the state of inquiry to the state of awaiting approval. And we want it to send out the outflow job of quote submit for approval email template. So let's go back to our quote workflow, and what you'll see is that we now have the submit for approval that takes us to awaiting approval. We have a way to get in, but now we need a way to get out. Naturally, I would think the best way to get out of this would be to go to tentative or confirmed. You might even set up several different levels of workflow. Maybe you go from inquiry to submit for approval, and then from awaiting approval, you set up several new actions like send back to account manager for changes, and maybe that would just go back to inquiry. You might have another action that says set to tentative, another one that says set to confirmed. So let's set up a new workflow action, and we'll just keep it simple and say confirm quote. The source state is awaiting approval because that's where we want to execute it from. Target state is confirmed, and then we want to be able to send out the quote confirmed email template to inform anybody that this quote has been confirmed. This also might be a good example of using an executor group, because remember, think about the process right now. If you are submitting it to approval to a head of sales or a boss, most people will still be able to go in and access the quote when it's in this state. But do you want them to be able to perform that workflow action of confirm quote? Because what's the point of having somebody just be able to go in and confirm their own quote if it needs to be approved first? So maybe for only this confirm quote from the awaiting approval state, you might say only administrators can execute that. Again, that's not a requirement. I'm just showing you a few examples of what you can do with your workflow actions. So let's just go to, or I'm sorry, I don't want the pull sheet. I want the actual quote. And let's just look at what that workflow process looks like now. So let's pretend like we just started this quote. So I'm going to reset it to inquiry. And now for my inquiry state, I'm going to have a submit for approval. In fact, this might be another good example too of if you're implementing something like this, you would go into the confirm quote from your inquiry and also restrict that to only certain people. Because again, if just one of your sales rep is creating a quote and you absolutely need them to submit it for approval before it gets confirmed, then you can go in and set up executor groups for a confirm quote, set to tentative, so that they only see the submit for approval. But let's click submit for approval. It sends out that workflow job email template of submitted for approval. I could manually add users if I want to, so I could send that to Chris if I want. And then once I'm in the submitted for approval state, let's go back to our calendar. Notice the status is still inquiry, but and then the last step, of course, I would come and confirm that quote. So I've seen some of our customers that will literally have 10 to 15 different levels set up, starting with inquiry, going to submit for approval, and then from the awaiting approval state, they either have a way to confirm it or send it back or send it to even a next level, maybe like a peer review or something like that. And then from confirmed, they might have different levels of canceling the quote or resetting it or sending it back for approval for changes and things like that. The sky is the limit with how many of these different workflow actions and states that you can set up. But I just wanted to show you that as a quick example of how you can start moving in that direction so that you can have these different levels to go into different states that may or may not be tied to unique statuses, and then setting up the actions to get out of those new states that you created. So just a word of warning, be careful as you're setting these up. If you set up a new state, like awaiting approval, and set up an action to get into that state, always make sure that you're setting up actions to get out of that state too. Because if you don't have any actions getting out of a state, somebody will open up a quote and their workflow section is just going to be blank. And they have no way to get in and out of that state. So just always make sure that you're creating ways to get in and ways to get out. So we'll go ahead and end there. As usual, I always recommend going to our forum. It's just forum.flexrentalsolutions.com. Checking out the webinars board. This is where you're always going to find the different webinars that we have announced, and you can come in here and just post a reply. You can always ask questions, share some ideas that you might have of different workflows that you've maybe created in your system. And again, as always, if you have any specific questions that are more technical in nature, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.